Right now, somewhere in America, a family is sitting in a funeral home and being asked a question that sounds almost completely ordinary:
We've laid out
burial
the two
or
options for you
cremation?
here.
For most
Take your
people, it
time
is
to
a
review the
practical
details
decision.
for the
It
cremation
might depend
and
on
the
money,
traditional
family
service.
tradition, or what the person wanted before they died. But there is an ancient book that looks at death from a completely different angle. The Book of Enoch doesn't begin by asking where the body will be buried. It asks what happens to the person after the body is gone. And its answer is much stranger than the simple heaven and hell picture most people grew up with. According to Enoch, the dead are not all waiting in the same place. Some are separated from others. Some are kept in light. Some are held in darkness. Some are waiting because they escaped punishment during their lifetime. And some are waiting because they were victims of terrible injustice. Then, at the end of the age, the places that have held the dead are commanded to give them back. The earth gives back what it received. The realm of the dead gives back what it held. And even destruction is forced to surrender what belongs to it. That last detail is particularly strange, because if destruction itself cannot permanently keep what it has taken, then what does that mean for someone whose body was completely destroyed? What happens to someone who was burned? What happens to someone whose ashes were scattered? What happens to someone whose body was never recovered? And most importantly, does the Book of Enoch actually say that cremation changes your fate? The answer may surprise you. To understand it, we have to go back to a mountain. Not a symbolic mountain from a dream, but a place Enoch says he was actually shown. In chapter 22, Enoch describes being taken to the western part of the earth. There he sees a great mountain made of hard rock. But the mountain isn't simply a mountain. Inside it are hollow spaces, hidden chambers, places separated from the ordinary world. And this is where Enoch receives one of the oldest, detailed descriptions of the afterlife preserved from the ancient world. An angel named Raphael explains what Enoch is seeing. The dead are not all gathered together, they are divided. There are 4 different places, and immediately one of them stands out. It is brighter than the others. There is a spring of water there. The spirits of the righteous are kept there. They are waiting. They are not described as simply ceasing to exist. They are not wandering aimlessly. They are being preserved until the appointed judgment. The other chambers are different, darker, more disturbing. One is associated with people who sinned but were never punished during their lives. Think about how powerful that idea would have been in the ancient world. Imagine a man who becomes wealthy through violence. He destroys families. He steals from the weak. He manipulates the law. He grows old and then dies peacefully in his bed. From the perspective of everyone watching, he got away with it. His victims suffered. He didn't. But Enoch says the story isn't finished. Death does not close the case. The person enters a place where the consequences he escaped during life are waiting for him. That means Enoch's afterlife is not simply a reward and punishment system. It is also a system of unfinished justice. Things that were never resolved on earth remain unresolved after death. And then Enoch describes another chamber. This one is associated with people who were murdered, the innocent dead. Their spirits cry out. They are waiting for justice. That image should sound familiar because it echoes one of the oldest biblical ideas about murder: the blood of Abel crying out from the ground. The victim may be dead, but the injustice has not disappeared. The universe has not forgotten. And this gives us the first major clue about what actually determines a person's fate in Enoch. It isn't the grave. It isn't the coffin. It isn't the condition of the corpse. It is the person's life. What they did, what happened to them, and whether justice was ever served. Notice what Raphael never says. He never says one chamber is for people who were buried correctly. He never says another is for people whose bodies were cremated. He never says the ashes of a person go to a special chamber. The method of burial simply isn't presented as the deciding factor. That becomes extremely important when we reach one of the most mysterious passages in the entire book. Chapter 51. Here Enoch begins describing the final resurrection, and the wording is unusual. The earth will give back what has been entrusted to it. The realm of the dead will give back what it has received, and destruction will give back what it owes. Three different places, three different forms of possession. And that raises an obvious question. Why does Enoch need to mention destruction at all? If resurrection only concerned bodies buried in the ground, then the earth would be enough. But ancient people knew that not everyone ended up in a grave. Bodies could be burned, bodies could be lost at sea, bodies could be destroyed in war, bodies could be eaten by animals. A person's remains could disappear completely. So the idea of resurrection had to solve a problem that modern people sometimes forget. What happens to the person whose body is gone? Enoch's answer seems to be that physical destruction is not the final word. The universe itself has a record of what it has taken, and at the appointed time, it has to give it back. This is why the phrase about destruction matters. It prevents the obvious conclusion that only intact bodies can participate in the resurrection. The dead can be destroyed, but they cannot be permanently erased. And that is very different from saying that cremated people are sent to a special punishment. Enoch never makes that connection. The text separates ordinary death from final judgment. And once you understand that distinction, another part of the book becomes much clearer. Because Enoch does talk about fire, a lot. But the fire he describes is not a funeral fire. It is a judgment fire. That difference is everything. In chapter 90, Enoch witnesses a final judgment scene. The imagery becomes almost apocalyptic. A fiery abyss opens. Corrupt spiritual authorities are judged. Then another group is brought forward. They are represented as sheep who have become blind and gone astray. These aren't people being punished because someone chose cremation. They are being punished because of what they did, because of corruption, because they led others away, because they violated the moral order. And then the fire appears. The text describes them being burned. Their bones are burned with them. But this fire comes after judgment. It is the result of a verdict. It is not something that happens because a family decided to use a crematorium. That is one of the most important distinctions in the entire story. Enoch's fire is judicial, not funerary. And the difference becomes even clearer in chapter 108. There, Enoch describes a place of punishment for sinners and blasphemers. But the location is strange. It is described as being outside the ordinary world, a place where there is no normal earth. The spirits experience fire, they suffer, they cry out. But again, this isn't a cemetery. A mortician cannot send someone there. A funeral director cannot accidentally put someone there. A family cannot choose it. It is not determined by what happened to the body. It is determined by judgment. So imagine two people. The first lives a cruel and corrupt life. He dies and is buried in a magnificent tomb. His body is preserved. His family spends a fortune on the funeral. The second person lives a righteous life. After death, the body is cremated and the ashes are scattered. If Enoch's system worked according to the physical condition of the corpse, the first person would appear to have an advantage. But that is not what the text describes. The righteous person remains righteous. The wicked person remains accountable. The grave does not save the wicked, and the fire does not condemn the righteous. The determining factor is the life. This is where the ancient text begins to collide with later religious history, because early Christians increasingly emphasized burial. And there were several reasons for this. The first was symbolic. Christians believed in bodily resurrection. The body was not disposable trash. It was connected to the identity of the person who would ultimately be raised. So burial became a statement. The body is sleeping. The body is waiting. Death is temporary. And this is where an interesting word enters the story. The ancient Greek term used for a cemetery is connected to the idea of a sleeping place, a place where someone lies down. That is where our modern word cemetery ultimately comes from. The symbolism is powerful. A cemetery isn't just a place for dead bodies. It is a place of waiting. The person is not believed to have reached their final state. They are waiting for resurrection. But there was another reason burial became so emotionally important. Christian martyrs. The Roman world knew that Christians believed in resurrection, and in some cases, destroying the body could become an intentional act of psychological warfare. If the body was burned, if the ashes were scattered, if the remains were thrown into a river, then the message was obvious. What exactly is your God going to resurrect now? For believers who expected bodily resurrection, this was not just an insult, it was an attack on their hope. And Christian communities sometimes went to extraordinary lengths to recover the remains of martyrs. They searched for fragments, they collected ashes, they attempted to give the dead a proper burial. The grave became a statement of faith. But here is the important part. The fact that burial became a powerful Christian symbol does not automatically mean that Enoch teaches cremation prevents resurrection. Those are two different claims. One concerns symbolism, the other concerns the actual mechanics of resurrection. And even the logic of resurrection creates a problem for the idea that God requires an intact corpse. Think about someone who died 2,000 years ago. If they were buried, their body did not remain perfectly preserved. It decomposed. The bones eventually broke down. The material returned to the earth. So after enough time, what exactly is the difference between a buried body that has become dust and cremated remains that have become ash? Biologically, the distinction becomes smaller and smaller. If God can resurrect someone whose body has returned to the earth over centuries, then physical destruction cannot be the ultimate obstacle. And Enoch appears to understand this. That is why destruction itself is included in the final restoration. The universe is not allowed to keep the dead forever. Not the earth, not the realm of the dead, not destruction. Everything eventually has to surrender what it holds. But there is an even deeper idea hidden inside this. Enoch isn't merely saying that bodies will come back. He is saying that death cannot erase the moral record of a person. That is much more disturbing, because if your body can disappear but your actions remain, then death is not an escape. This is why the murdered are so important in chapter 22. Imagine an innocent person killed by someone powerful. The murderer is never caught. The family never receives justice. The killer grows old, then he dies. If death simply erased everything, the injustice would remain permanent. But Enoch says it doesn't. The victim is still known. The killer is still accountable. The case remains open. That is the logic of the four chambers. They are not merely storage rooms for dead bodies. They are part of a moral system. The righteous are preserved. The unjustly killed are remembered. The unpunished sinners are held. And the final judgment will resolve what death failed to resolve. This also explains why Enoch spends so much time talking about the Watchers. The Watchers are not ordinary sinners. They are supernatural beings who, according to the story, crossed boundaries they were never supposed to cross. They descended. They interacted with humanity. They revealed forbidden knowledge. And their actions contributed to the corruption of the world before the flood. Their punishment is therefore different from the punishment of ordinary human beings. They are bound. They are confined. They are waiting for judgment. And eventually they are associated with the fiery punishment. Again, the pattern remains. The severity of the punishment is connected to the crime, not to the method by which their bodies were disposed. The Book of Enoch is obsessed with boundaries. The boundary between heaven and earth, the boundary between angels and humans, the boundary between life and death, and finally the boundary between judgment and restoration. When those boundaries are violated, consequences follow. That is why the story of the afterlife cannot be separated from the story of human behavior. The dead are not simply categorized according to what happened to their bodies. They are categorized according to what happened during their lives. And that brings us back to cremation. There is an understandable modern fear behind the question. If the body is burned, is something lost? Does the destruction of the body make resurrection harder? Does scattering the ashes somehow scatter the person's future? The Book of Enoch gives us no reason to say that. In fact, the structure of its resurrection story points in the opposite direction. The earth can give back what it holds. The realm of the dead can give back what it holds. Destruction can give back what it owes. The final restoration is not limited by the condition of the corpse. And that makes the symbolism of cremation much more complicated. A religious tradition may prefer burial. A family may consider burial sacred. A person may believe burial better represents resurrection. Those are legitimate theological and cultural positions. But they are not the same thing as saying that cremation places a person in a different chamber of Enoch's afterlife. The ancient text itself does not make that claim. And there is another detail worth remembering. The Book of Enoch was preserved in a remarkably unusual way. For most of Christianity, the complete text eventually disappeared from ordinary use. Fragments remained, references survived, but the full book was preserved in the Ethiopian Christian tradition. For centuries, people outside that tradition knew very little about the complete work. And that matters because Enoch contains ideas that sound surprisingly different from the simplified afterlife imagery familiar to many modern Christians. There is no single waiting room. There is a structured world of the dead. There are different chambers. There are spirits waiting for judgment. There are cosmic beings awaiting punishment. There is a final restoration. And there is a moral record that death cannot erase. In other words, Enoch's afterlife is less like a destination and more like a process. Death does not finish the story. It moves the person into another stage of the story. The final judgment comes later. The resurrection comes later. The ultimate fate is not necessarily decided by what the funeral home does with the body. And this brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable conclusion. If Enoch is right within its own worldview, then the funeral is not the moment when your fate is decided. The funeral happens after the decisions have already been made. Not decisions about burial, decisions about life. Every act, every injustice, every act of mercy, every betrayal, every time someone was helped, every time someone was harmed. The grave receives the body, but it doesn't receive the moral record. That remains. And eventually, according to Enoch, the places that have held the dead have to surrender them. The earth gives back what it received. The realm of the dead gives back what it held. Destruction gives back what it owes. Nothing remains permanently hidden. Nothing remains permanently lost. And that changes the original question. The question isn't really burial or cremation. The deeper question is, what happens when death can no longer hide what happened during your life? Because Enoch's most frightening warning isn't about ashes. It isn't about coffins. It isn't about cemeteries. It is about accountability. The body can disappear. The grave can collapse. The ashes can scatter. The name on the tombstone can fade. But according to Enoch, none of those things erase the story of the person who lived inside that body. And perhaps that is why the 4 chambers in the mountain are so important. They show us a world where death does not create equality. It reveals what was already there. The righteous are separated from the wicked. The victims are separated from those who escape justice. The corrupt are eventually brought before judgment. And the final resurrection gathers back what death believed it had permanently taken. So the ancient mystery may not be that cremation changes your fate. It may be the opposite. Your fate was never in the hands of the funeral director. It was never hidden inside the coffin. It was never contained in the ashes. The question Enoch keeps asking is much harder. What did you do with the life you were given? Because according to this ancient vision, death does not destroy the answer, it preserves it. And one day, when the earth gives back what it holds, when the realm of the dead gives back what it holds, and when even destruction is forced to surrender what it owes, the body will no longer be the most important thing returning. The record of the life will be returning with it. And that may be the real secret behind the ancient story. The dead are not simply waiting to be resurrected. They are waiting for judgment. And if Enoch is right, the question won't be whether your body was buried or burned. The question will be, what kind of person emerges when everything that death was able to hide is finally brought back into the light? But Enoch's story doesn't end there. Because after describing the chambers of the dead, the resurrection, the final judgment, the Watchers in the fiery abyss, the book turns towards something even more mysterious. It begins describing the figures who will stand at the center of the final conflict. A chosen figure, a judgment, a kingdom, and enemies who believe they can escape what has been written against them. And that leads to a much darker question. If Enoch says that even the dead cannot escape the record of their actions, what happens when that same judgment reaches the rulers of the living world? That is where the story of Enoch's final days becomes even more disturbing.